Day 10. Imagine that a boxer goes into the ring, but his opponent doesn't show up. What's he supposed to do? With everyone watching, he'd look kind of silly if he just stood there, right? But with good showmanship and clever image management, he could emphasize his walkover victory with some celebratory air punches and maybe a display of manly force. Well, that seems to be what a large portion of the U.S. Navy is engaged in the Caribbean on October 25th, 1962. I'm Indy Neidell. This is TimeGhost, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, the U.S. enforcement of its blockade on Cuba continues despite the fact that the Russians seem to have turned back all their ships that might be suspected of transporting arms or military equipment. But do not forget that 4 Soviet submarines are still on their way towards Cuba. Yesterday, the U.S. administration noted that the Russians were respecting the blockade, although the military had noticed already 2 days ago. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev wrote to U.S. President John F. Kennedy with a forceful rebuke of the U.S. blockade, and the U.S. preparations to confront the Russians at the United Nations continued. This confrontation is incredibly important for the Americans, as they need the rest of the world to have no doubt whatsoever that the Soviets have installed both mid and intermediate range ballistic missiles on Cuba. You see, up until now, the USSR have neither denied nor confirmed this. While most US allies believe it, the world public might not, and the Eastern Bloc countries stand with the Soviets. All over the world, protests against the blockade have been erupting over the last 2 days. In the Eastern Bloc, Europe, and Latin America, the Soviets have mobilized their Communist Party friends to besiege U.S. embassies and demand an end to the blockade. This is no mere exercise in grandstanding. Now, remember that the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, has so far been the only person in the U.S. administration to vocally oppose all forceful actions to resolve the crisis, including the blockade. His preferred course of action would be negotiating the closure of U.S. foreign military bases and removing the American missiles in Turkey and Italy in exchange for the Soviets leaving Cuba. Today, he has to confront the Soviets in open session at the UN in front of the TV cameras of the whole world. Unlike the Navy, Stevenson will most certainly meet his opponent, USSR Ambassador to the UN Valerian Zorin, in the ring. Zorin is a formidable opponent. He's sharp, he's gifted in rhetoric. He's also something of a sad figure, which we won't find out until after his death 2 decades from now. He didn't really want to be a diplomat at all, actually. His real passion was music, and he deeply regretted only being an amateur and never a published poet. Anyhow, there is grave doubt by many on the ExComm, the U.S. committee dealing with the crisis, that Stevenson is really up to the task. Much pressure has been brought to bear on President Kennedy to bring in someone else. Instead, Kennedy has stood by Stevenson and called in their mutual friend and presidential advisor, John J. McCloy, as moral support for good old Adlai. Stevenson has promised to stand his ground, but it doesn't look great when he starts off in his traditionally diplomatic and conciliatory tone.
My government is most anxious to effect a peaceful resolution of this affair. We continue to hope that the Soviet Union will work with us to diminish not only the new danger which has suddenly shadowed the peace, but all of the conflicts that divide the world.
He vacillates a bit more, but then picks up speed.
The argument in its essence of the Soviet Union is that it was not the Soviet Union which created this threat to peace by secretly installing these weapons in Cuba, but that it was the United States which created this crisis by discovering and reporting these installations. This is the first time, I confess, that I've ever heard it said that the crime is not the burglar, but the discovery of the burglar, and that the threat is not the clandestine missiles in Cuba, but their discovery and the limited measures taken to quarantine further infection.
His arguments get more and more decisive, and then he goes off script and delivers what he has promised the president.
And finally, the other day, Mr. Zorin, I remind you that you didn't deny the existence of these weapons. Instead, we heard that they had suddenly become defensive weapons. But today, again, if I heard you correctly, you now say they don't exist, or that we haven't proved they exist. With another fine flood of rhetorical scorn. All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
You're in the court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
I should like to say,
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон.
Sir, will you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
Stevenson then shows the photographs of the missile sites, most importantly, the low-altitude shots taken 2 days ago. He explains to the Council in detail what they are looking at and asks again if the Soviet denies the existence of their nuclear missiles on Cuba in view of this irrefutable proof. Zorin once again obfuscates. Stevenson has stood his ground and made the Russians look like the bad guys. In the roughly 1 hour that his presentation lasts, he has done more than influence world politics on an historical level. He has also made television history. Ever since, this moment has been replayed again and again as an iconic moment of the Cold War. Meanwhile, Khrushchev has already decided to throw in the towel. Hours before the confrontation in the UN headquarters in New York, the Soviet Presidium has met to discuss the crisis again. During the night, they've received another direct letter from President Kennedy imploring them to not do anything rash and to initiate negotiations. Chairman Khrushchev opens the meeting with a concession of defeat. He says, "The further course of events is proceeding in the following way. The Americans say that the missile installations in Cuba must be dismantled. Perhaps this will need to be done. This is not capitulation on our part, because if we fire, they will also fire. There is no doubt that the Americans became frightened. This is clear. Kennedy was sleeping with a wooden knife." Mikoyan asks, why with a wooden one? Referring to the pre-toilet paper way of cleaning oneself with a wooden stick, Khrushchev replies, "When a man goes bear hunting for the first time, he takes with him a wooden knife so that it will be easier to clean his trousers." Now, at this moment, Nikita Khrushchev has just sealed his political fate. His jest is the start of a long row of attempts to pitch the now failed Operation Anadir as a success because it scared the Americans. In fact, he had used some of his last political clout to sell the idea in the first place. It will take another 2 years for the rest of the men in the room to oust him and seize power, but in 1964 they will. Moreover, although the Presidium agrees unanimously and they start drafting a letter to the US president offering to withdraw the missiles if the US promises to not invade Cuba, the crisis is not over by a long shot. Like we've said many times so far in this series, when you let out the leash on the dogs of war, it risks slipping out of your hand, and that is what is happening right now. Around Cuba, the US Navy is circling, looking for something to do, or at least someone to intercept. They want to stop and board 2 tankers, but since the Soviets look like they're respecting the blockade on arms deliveries, the White House is uncertain. All the Navy can do is follow them and wait. Within the military and the XCOM, people now begin to worry that it'll look like they're not enforcing the blockade if they don't board some vessel, even one that they know they'll let through. But on the other hand, they don't want to provoke the Russians.
Have we got any other ships we can board now? There will, non-Soviet ships
Finally, in order to not provoke the Russians, while the prospect of negotiations at the UN are on the table, they decide to let the tankers through and go after a Lebanese freighter, their Markula, instead. Only one problem: the Navy has lost track of it, pursuing a number of other ships they think might be it. One of them is the East German ship Volker Freundschaft. Now, this is a combined cargo and passenger ship with 1,500 technicians and students on board who have nothing at all to do with missiles. For a while, they consider boarding her anyway, but at 10:45 Eastern Time, they find the Markula again and stop it. Tomorrow morning, it becomes the first ship to be boarded and searched by the U.S. Navy during the blockade. Today, though, the administration is not really certain what to tell the public about the blockade and if and how it's working.
Be very careful about putting out a general impression that most of them are going back, because I do pick up one who put the B on us for being warmonger. Well, we're caught with one crowd or the other. Okay, yeah. But I think we don't want to sense euphoria, that's right, which I thought. That is right. The message of Khrushchev is much tougher than that. I thought the statement last night was pretty good.
They meet again in the late afternoon to discuss what to do next. Robert Kennedy seems to go back to the idea of airstrikes, this time as a way to move the confrontation from the Soviets to the Cubans.
And ultimately, we might decide that it would be better, rather than have the confrontation with the Russians at sea, that it might be better to have knock out their missile base. That's the first step. I don't know, it might, that's more with the Cubans than with them, and we go through and we tell them to get out of that vicinity in 10 minutes, and then we go through and knock the base. I don't know, I think it's got some advantage in the fact that gives you a little bit more time to play with.
While they continue discussing this, USSR Ambassador to the U.S. Dobrynin messages the Kremlin in Moscow that he has overheard a conversation between American journalists that an invasion of Cuba is imminent. Khrushchev is still drafting his letter. The surveillance flights over Cuba are being increased. 4 nuclear-armed submarines are playing cat and mouse with the U.S. Navy somewhere in the Western Atlantic. On Cuba itself, Fidel Castro is preparing his armed forces to shove the Yankees back into the ocean if they invade, or at least shoot down some of those planes that keep invading Cuban airspace. The crisis is still growing and growing. See you on day 11 when war grows ever closer. If you're just joining the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can find our first episode right here. Don't forget to subscribe, and please support us on Patreon so that we can make more awesome history. Good night and good luck.